Chief Research Specialist at the Human Science Research Council. The idea of today's webinar is to present a research project that the Mandela Institute will be running for this year. This is a project that is being funded by Facebook that focuses on data protection regulation in Africa. And Alex and I are going to be introducing this project to you, as well as the upcoming webinars and research outputs that will be coming out of this project. And to kick off, I'm going to do a bit of context setting and then hand over to Alex to do a deeper dive into what this project is all about before we have our guest speaker, Rachel Adams, give a 15-minute talk. We all probably remember the first time we had to insert our credit card details into an online platform, and we are probably very nervous about being scammed. But today, most of us probably already have our credit card details stored and preloaded on various digital platforms like Amazon and Netflix. What we are seeing globally is a strange phenomenon. Across the globe, we are seeing a decline in trust of traditional institutions such as banks and, in some cases, religious and higher education institutions. Yet, a trust leap is happening in digital offerings. The craze for Bitcoin is one example, but at a local level, we're also seeing some innovative solutions through startups responding to specific needs within the local economies, within various local economies. How data is regulated is crucial to the success of the digital economies of most states. With the adoption of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement in 2019, African states are positioning themselves as leaders and defenders of free trade. The agreement has created the world's largest free trade area since the WTO was established, but this agreement is missing a reference to the 21st century's most important commodity, in my opinion, data. While the agreement reduces barriers to trade within Africa, major African markets like Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa are effectively regulating their digital economies through data localization laws that runs counter to the spirit of promoting free trade in Africa. Unencumbered data flows have become fundamental to the way the world does business. African states certainly recognize this, and over the last decade, about 17 countries have passed data localization laws on the continent. This project that we are running falls broadly under data protection, and my own focus today is on regulation through data localization. Governance of the digital economy can have a massive impact on the way that technologies can be used. African states have, in certain respects, struggled to catch up with this pace of change, and in their attempts to govern technology, they have used exported models which are often inappropriate for local context. And little attention is surprisingly not being paid to how resource constrained countries should approach digital regulation, either within their own countries or as an increasingly pressing transnational issue. Data localization is defined as the prevention of data transfer, access, and storage outside a country's borders, including through cloud storage. And states are adopting data localization laws. They often argue that this is in response to, for example, fears that sending citizens' data abroad would increase citizens' vulnerability to serious security and privacy threats from foreign actors. While these fears are certainly legitimate, Africa's proliferation of data localization laws could also pose a significant barrier to the promise of a prosperous digital economy, even when these laws are driven by desires to promote local economic development. So there lies the conundrum of data regulation. While we know the successes of the digital revolution, which I don't need to state to this audience, it is necessary to, I think, reflect on the other side of the impact of data and new technology for Africa's economy. And a favorite case study that I use when teaching my banking and finance class is fintech and the disruption of microcredit in Africa. As you all probably know, microcredit, which broadly describes the provision of small loans to those with limited access to financial services, particularly for self-employment ventures, has been a key response to poverty across the globe. Today, African countries are pace setters in using fintech to develop new financial products, making microcredit more accessible to millions of Africans. And this trend has led to what I would describe as the financialization of poverty, where with the high cost of access to microcredit and a new purpose for microlending in funding people's daily needs rather than business ventures, there is an alarming increase in indebtedness across African states. In Kenya, which is the pioneer of fintech and microcredit industry in Africa, more than two-thirds of Kenyan borrowers are said to be caught in a debt spiral. This is revealing a form of digitized slow violence where Africans are being driven into cycles of financial capital that are premised not as the marketing would have it on empowerment, but on the profitability of perpetual debt. So we are seeing a rise of techno capitalists who believe all data is credit data, and we have regulatory responses to challenges such as this, with data localization only being one of them. And data localization is often justified on the basis of perhaps five broad reasons. One is the protection of personal data, the need for access to data by local law enforcement and to ensure national security, to advance local economic competitiveness, and also to level the regulatory playing field. However, a closer look at these justifications reveal some other unintended consequences. And one of those, which I'll speak to very briefly, is trade. In terms of trade rules, there are questions of how digital trade rules will interact with existing trade agreements. In services, for instance, a number of African countries have maintained protections under the General Agreement on Trade in Services under the WTO. Rapid growth in digitally delivered services is weakening these protections, and many countries suspect that digital trade rules are a way to push for complete free market access for services. Data localization can then effectively be a trade barrier given the impact on free trade, given the impact on the increase in transaction costs and the efficiency of corporations, and ultimately the hampering of economic growth. All these themes are going to be explored in this project, and I will go into detail shortly about the different research outputs that we are going to be producing. So the overall research question that this project aims to tackle is how can African countries use digital regulation to promote inclusive development and to modernize intra-African trade, and why should transnational regulation play a role in shaping these developments? And in terms of our objectives, global rules and standards are often not a good fit for developing countries, which have capacity constraints and policy goals that often differ from those of developed nations. Any set of rules with impact outside the borders of a single country should always consider a tiered approach, starting with a minimum implementable baseline that any country could reasonably be expected to meet in order to engage with cross-border digital trade. Also, developing countries, we believe, should be able to chart their own path towards international cooperation to shape cross-border regulation of technology. And this could start with regional coalitions or agreements between non-regional groups of countries with shared values and goals. It also may be easier to start with less contentious topics such as privacy and competition regulation. And successful implementation of these principles will depend on embedding them into a wider political economy, taking into account each country's unique needs and priorities. Some of these principles are inherently cross-border, while others demand both domestic and international approaches, but they all describe outcomes that could be achieved through international cooperation and that could improve people's lives in developing countries. At the center of this research are private corporations whose behavior require regulation as they generate data, drive cross-border digital trade, and engage in competition practices that are ahead of the current regulatory status quo in most African states. So to regulate effectively and to propose effective regulation, we first need to know what kind of corporate power we're regulating. We have some corporations using a form of gatekeeper power, which essentially means it gives platforms the ability to extort. And then you also have some form of leveraging power, which gives platforms the incentive to discriminate in favor of their own services. And then you also have some form of information exploitation power, which where digital platforms use data to exploit and kill off competition. So how to achieve corporate accountability is crucial. And our guest today, Rachel Adams, will be discussing what challenges does AI and data pose in Africa, particularly in terms of inequality and poverty, and how far can data protection address these issues. In terms of the overall implications of our research, the problems raised by digitalization, the problems that policymakers feel compelled to solve, are largely a matter of domestic policy, but their causes are anything but domestic. Citizens' rights to privacy, competition between firms, security and law enforcement, business taxation, all of these matters traditionally fall within the remit of the nation state rather than the web of international intergovernmental institutions. But digital firms operate across borders at almost no marginal cost, and their lack of physical presence in developing countries render enforcement of jurisdictions and local regulations difficult. While many people in a given country might interact with a digital firm, that firm can operate with no office or physical activity within the country, making it difficult to enforce any governance regime. So the overall methods and strategy for analysis in this project is about paying attention to poorer or resource-constrained countries, to develop context-specific digital regulation, and to promote international cooperation to shape cross-border regulation of technology. And we have an amazing network of researchers that will be implementing this project for us. We will be developing some interesting case studies across 3 countries. The first case study on South Africa, looking at the potential impact of data localization on South Africa's project of sustainable development, is being led by Dr. Chanel Vandenberg, and we have a webinar that we're going to be hosting next week, Friday, that is going to be speaking specifically to this case study. We also have 2 excellent researchers in Kenya that will be exploring the nexus between access to health, data localization in Kenya's data protection framework, as well as data localization and its implications on Kenya's economy. And we also have 2 researchers working on the Nigerian case study that are going to be examining the economic impact of data localization and protection of trade in Nigeria. Outside of these country case studies, we also have policy briefs that are going to be produced, focusing on regional competition policy that is being led by Professor Jonathan Claren, then one on African regional trade and data protection that is being done by Dr. Regis Simo, and another one on economic implications of data localization and the facilitation of foreign direct investment, which Alex is going to be leading, and another one on data ownership, which Gabi Razano and I will be leading. So I'm going to pause here, and I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Alex to do a deeper dive for this project. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, Bola. Let me just share my screen and the presentation I have. Just give me 1 second. All right, there we go. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you. Cool. All right, so there we go. All right. Hello, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alex Bielefeld. I'm a senior researcher at the Mandela Institute. So this is really just a very broad level introduction to the research project and sort of just doing a broad picture setting for the context in which we sort of operate in when producing these policy briefs and research pieces. And so I'm just going to touch on sort of a number of broad issues, and it may seem that I'm skimming over some of the details, but I think that's because a lot of the details will follow at a later stage in later research and policy briefs and so forth. So to the extent that I'm not covering everything, I think do look out for those future presentations and research pieces, because they will probably fill a lot of the gaps that I leave here today. So this is really just a broad introduction with the following structure. So basically I want to look at three things today. The first is, like I said, the sort of broad economic context we find ourselves in. So there I talk about the rise of the data economy, the fourth industrial revolution, and the continuing great convergence. And I'll explain in a moment, for those of you who haven't heard the term before, what the great convergence is and what that means for the global economy. Then I'll take a brief look at the economics of data protection, with a focus on sort of definitions and constructions. I think it's quite an unsettled area still, with a lot of debate about how one frames these sorts of issues. So we'll get to that. And then finally, just to think about data protection and economic integration from the perspective of Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa in particular, but sort of to just sketch the general international context and the prevailing approaches taken by sort of dominant countries in those spaces, particularly in relation to economic integration. Okay, so on the rise of the data economy, 4IR, and the continuing great convergence. So I sort of start this introductory policy brief that I've done by saying what preceded the 4IR was the third industrial revolution, which effectively was digitalization, and the rise of the digital economy. Now, that still continues today and is sort of a necessary prerequisite, as I see it, for the fourth industrial revolution that followed it and which we have now kicked off. So that's why I start this line of the PowerPoint with the rise of the digital economy, the generation of data. So the rise of the digital economy enabled the generation of data, and that enabled in turn the rise of the data economy. So the third industrial revolution is sort of the rise of the digital economy, if you will, whereas the fourth is the rise of the data economy. And both those trends are sort of largely still unfolding. The digital economy is far more advanced. The data economy is a newer concept, and it sort of enables all the sort of technologies of the 4IR, or most of them in any way. Then this idea of the great convergence. So that also sort of started at the same time as the third industrial revolution. And what it basically refers to is this idea of countries predominantly in Asia catching up with the rich world in terms of income. So, the term comes from a book by Richard Baldwin, who's an economist who works at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And he wrote this book called The Great Convergence, and it's sort of a follow-on on an earlier book that was written by a different economist that was The Great Divergence. So up until that point, you had sort of seen sort of European countries, the United States and Japan, which collectively form sort of this group of countries that Baldwin refers to as the G7. The major economies of Europe, the US and Japan, and they sort of just pull away in terms of economic size, I guess, and in terms of economic development from the rest of the world. And that pretty much continues all the way until more or less when the third industrial revolution starts, which is sort of in the early 1980s, really. And at that point, you start seeing the rise of particularly China, but also a number of other countries in Asia predominantly. So India, also South Korea, Singapore, a variety of other Asian countries, they all sort of start closing this gap with the richer countries. And so what this basically all gives us is geopolitical tensions for a start. So China in particular, with its closing of the gap between it and the US, there's this increasing hegemonic struggle between the two, with the EU also quietly in the mix because they don't have as much of an explicit foreign policy as the other two do, perhaps, but the global economy is increasingly characterized by these geopolitical tensions. You also have this sort of superstar tech firm emergence in a variety of these larger countries, and they start to dominate their local economies, but also they start to dominate other economies. And so the largest 5 firms in the US, for example, with the exception of Amazon, all rely on other countries for a majority of their revenue. You also see the rise of these winner-takes-all and winner-takes-most markets. So, digitalization and the rise of the data economy, sort of you end up with these markets that sort of tend towards scale and tend towards winner-takes-all. All of this leads to countries competing quite fiercely with one another to be at the technological frontier, and sort of large firms are, they have their impacts domestically, but they're also promoted because they're seen as, fulfilling important developmental goals. So against all of that backdrop, you also see rising economic inequality within countries, which sort of, reinforces the geopolitical tensions in many respects, because you see countries blaming one another for rising economic inequality in their own jurisdictions, and perhaps with some justification. And then you also start seeing these digital divides emerge as well, between and within countries. And I think it's important that we emphasize that they've emerged between and within countries, not just between or not just within. And so these sort of follow the great convergence type pattern. And I guess what's important to mention there is that you have this declining international level inequality between countries, but it's only really between Asia and the West, Europe and the United States and Japan. But you see sort of Latin America and Africa still not quite converging with the rest of the world. And so you have some serious digital divides between the economies of the world. They still exist, even if they're converging to some degree. They're not converging everywhere. And then, of course, the rising within country inequality also drives these digital divides within countries. And these divides are obviously quite stark in countries such as South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria. Then I also discussed the rise of intangibles and sort of jurisdictional challenges that are associated with that. So it's far easier to move something intangible across borders, and so this brings a bunch of challenges for where value is created and who has jurisdiction over particular issues. And this all has, significant implications for taxation, trade, and competition, and so forth, because it becomes more difficult to tax, for example, intellectual property when it sits in Bermuda as opposed to in South Africa. Okay, so that brings us to the economics of data protection, and I think here there are a lot of questions. For a start, what are data exactly, and what are data markets, and how can we think of these things in economic terms? So data in this question, or in this particular sense, I think goes beyond mere information. It goes to information that is collected and stored with a view to using it as a factor of production, essentially. And data markets then correspondingly involves trading data as a commodity back and forth, in essence. But within that construction, one can look at this traditional sort of your traditional rivalrous and excludable distinctions in economics and sort of think, okay, well, where does data really fit in? Can you own data, for example, or is it something, I mean, this is something that's come up quite recently in the draft cloud policy that's been put forth by the South African government, for example, where there's mention of the ownership of data. But it's not particularly clear whether you can, in fact, earn data or not. And so there are lots of like definitional, constructional type issues that arise here. And one of them is this issue of ownership and, whether you can own data or whether you can only control it and whether you can grant access to it, or how does it all work? And I think generally speaking, there's one thing that we do know, which is that if I use data, that does not exclude you from using it at the same time. So data is not rivalrous, which means that it can be reused by many people or used by many people at the same time. So that sort of places it, in certain parts of the quadrants, and then, whether they're excludable or not is a whole other question. But that, there's still some debate to what extent are there actually rules that can prevent people from accessing data, and to what extent can you really have fully sort of non-excludable data when there are issues such as cybersecurity, right? If someone hacks you, then your data suddenly becomes excludable. Okay, so with that in place, I then sort of proceed in the policy brief to go on to what are the data in data protection specifically, because data there doesn't just refer to general data, it refers generally to personal data. So when people are referring to data protection, it's gotten to the point where even if you look at dictionaries, for example, data protection is basically protection of personal information or personal data. And this is sort of reflected in laws as well. So I've listed a whole bunch of laws there: the GDPR, the European General Law on Data Protection, the CCL is China's equivalent, CCPA. The United States doesn't have a general data protection law, so the CCPA is the California General Data Protection Law. Kenya Data Protection Law, the Nigerian Data Protection Law, and the South African Data Protection Law. All of these sort of define data protection, or the protection of personal information, or the protection of information rather as personal data or personal information. And loosely, personal information is information that can be used to identify a person, ordinarily a natural person, but sometimes also companies. So in the South African context, there's a limited provision for companies as well. And then, these are usually open lists, but oftentimes specifically enumerated categories find their ways into particular agreements. So, a list of what specifically constitutes personal data. Okay, so then what is data protection? Again, loosely, it's the safeguarding of personal data and information. And then basically, why do we need it? I think these are all fairly obvious questions, but because markets fail. So in this particular context, if you just allow data markets to operate in the ordinary course, they tend to externalize privacy, for example. There may be other things that they also externalize, but privacy is sort of the main one. And so you would want rules such as, the GDPR and the whole other list, the whole rest of the list there to ensure that, privacy is protected in data markets, basically. And finally, we get to this issue of data protection and economic integration. So economic integration in this context means international rules about cross-border data flows, specifically. So there are no multilateral rules in this regard currently. So basically, the best we have of evidence of these sorts of rules are free trade agreements and rules that have found their way into these free trade agreements. There are some limited rules, perhaps in the GATS, in the WTO context, but they're very limited and they're sort of mostly within the financial services space. Right. So also I just thought I would point out that economic integration does not equal cross-border data flows. So economic integration, as I use it here, is sort of a formal concept, like free trade agreements or rules that are agreed to by countries. And cross-border data flows is not the same thing. Just because you don't have economic integration in this sense doesn't necessarily have particular implications for cross-border data flows, but it does have some implications, obviously. They're just not the same. So China, for example, has fairly restrictive rules in relation to cross-border data flows and is not economically integrated with anyone in respect of cross-border data flows, but data still flows into China very extensively. So then why does it all matter? Basically, Fola had already discussed this earlier because it's important for accessing foreign markets and trading with other countries to the extent that data flows enable that sort of trade. Economic integration may matter because you would have rules that relate to whether cross-border data flows are permitted and so forth. It also matters because if data is allowed to flow across borders, then privacy again becomes a concern because not everyone has the same privacy regulation. And then, you run into a bunch of jurisdictional challenges as data crosses borders. So just quickly to look at the dominant sort of paradigms in the integration space, there are sort of three general approaches that have emerged. South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria. They don't have to adopt any of these approaches. They could adopt some of them, they could modify them, but there are sort of three dominant paradigms currently. There's the US approach, whereby there is generally in US free trade agreements a rule that cross-border data flows should be allowed unless, so the general rule is to say you can't prevent cross-border data flows, but then in certain instances you are permitted to do that and you have to justify it very carefully. And even then you may still not succeed if you are taken to a dispute settlement mechanism because you would have to prove your exceptional circumstances and so forth. The EU approach, I should also say that the US approach does incorporate some data protection standards. They require their trading partners to adopt particular data protection standards, but the extent to which these are comprehensive is very much up for debate. Then there's the EU approach. So the GDPR in the EU takes a fundamental rights approach, and in recent free trade practice, the EU has sort of proposed, but not yet concluded, that this is where their economic integration should start from the perspective that privacy is a fundamental right. They've tried to acknowledge as much in their recent negotiations with Indonesia in relation to a free trade agreement that they want to conclude with them. And then to say that, well, as a general proposition, nothing should stop us from implementing our own local data protection regulations, and nothing in this agreement will stop us from effectively enforcing the GDPR. But then they still take this sort of listing approach to say that, well, we still think cross-border data flows are helpful or good for economic development, what have you. So these particular forms of data protection, of cross-border data flows or restrictions on cross-border data flows are not permitted. So the EU, for example, proposes that, sorry. So wait, can you all still hear me? Sorry, I don't know what's happened there with my PowerPoint. Can you still?
Yes, we can, Alex, but you need to wrap up now. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm wrapping up. Thanks, Willa. So the EU approach basically lists certain things that they would like to avoid, like data localization. And then the Chinese approach is to have no integration whatsoever, which is just to regulate data flows by virtue of their domestic laws. And that will have cross-border implications, but they've not yet put anything in free trade agreements. And yeah, so basically those are the three dominant paradigms. And then within that context, to sort of just say, well, what approach should Kenya, Nigeria, and or South Africa adopt? You could take a combination of those approaches, one or the other. The EU approach seems most akin to the approaches taken in Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa so far, because they were also rights-based. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of the EU approach works. And so, yeah, I think that's sort of in part what we're trying to answer with this research project. So, yeah, thank you. Sorry, I know I've spoken a bit too much.
Thank you very much, Alex. We would take questions for the three of us after the presentation by Dr. Rachel Adams. Dr. Rachel Adams, like I said earlier, is a chief research specialist with the Human Sciences Research Council, and she will be focusing on AI and inequality in Africa and the role of data protection law. Over to you, Dr. Adams.
Thank you so much, Paula. Can you hear me? I can't see whether my mute button has gone off.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you. This is really, really interesting for me. I am a scholar that is working around the question of what does it mean to call for the decolonization of AI. And I'm only recently coming to explore these really, really critical and important economic arguments. So I think I'm learning more here than anyone. So thank you for the invitation. I want to start by questioning this hype around how data and artificial intelligence is going to massively benefit African economies. I don't doubt that it will, but I think that with the kind of discourse that we have around this hype, around the opportunities and the benefits it brings, we're failing to acknowledge and take note of the problems and the challenges. So that's what I want to look at a little bit today. So this is South Africa's white paper on science, technology and innovation, where they talk about how the success of the 4IR and of a data-driven economy is how we can exploit these economies to, how we can exploit these technologies to bolster the economy. And there's this general kind of sense that economic growth will inevitably be inclusive, will inevitably benefit everybody. But there's nothing inherent about economic growth. We've seen that over the last number of years. There's nothing inherent in economic growth that results in benefits for all and a fair distribution of wealth. So AI and data analytics, this is the kind of big sell, right? This comes from PricewaterhouseCoopers report that it will generate 15.7 trillion to the global economy by 2030, 6.6 trillion from increased productivity and $9.1 trillion from consumption and goods. And we're going to have a look a little bit at how that breaks down. And we don't have a good sense of that yet. And I find Alex's points around the great conversion Really, really, really interesting, because we see this rise in Asian economic might, particularly from China. But nobody's talking about where Africa lies in relation to that. So this is a World Bank report. It doesn't discuss AI and data, but it talks about this same date of 2030. And by that time, 90% of the world's poor will be in Africa. So I think we need to look at the kind of trajectories here and look at what benefits, what the kind of share of these economic benefits is looking to be like for the African region. So this again comes from PwC's report, where it maps out how 5.6% of the GDP, so 1.2 trillion of that 15.7, will be for Africa, Oceania, and other Asian markets. And you can see they've put their little icon there over Australia. And the African continent is kind of this huge, huge gap. Again, they've got here I think this is a very similar graph, if not the same one, so ignore that. But here we can see the kind of growth in GDP and productivity between 2017 and 2030 for the different regions from artificial intelligence. And as I think Alex's point about the great convergence, we see China specifically really rising, North America rising and then coming down again, and the rest of the world, which is pretty much Africa, marginally increases. But as we can see, there's a growing divide, a massive growing divide between where China and the other countries from the global north are in relation to where the rest of the world is at by 2030. So it looks like there's going to be rising global inequality as a result of artificial intelligence that we're not taking into account when we talk about the massive benefits it's going to bring. So what does this mean? What does this mean for countries in Africa? What does this mean in relation to the types of questions we are seeking to ask around inequality and poverty? So we are certainly looking at a kind of trajectory where the more powerful countries will become more and more powerful and will wield certain might over the less powerful countries. And the power will be determined by the technologies they have at their disposal. So historically, colonialism was enabled through the technologies that the West had at their disposal over other countries that it sought to colonize. And again, we're seeing those kinds of trends that we don't have enough kind of evidence and understanding of at the moment. So Ian Hogarth, he's spoken about AI nationalism, where those countries that don't have AI and data at their disposal, don't have the means of production of this, will become dependent on those countries that do. And we will see unequal trade and investment agreements that do not favor African countries or those in the global south. And we will see potentially states who are not able to protect the rights of their citizens or sacrifice individual rights in order to stay globally relevant and in order to allow corporations to be profitable. So we're going to see a global increase in inequality that's going to exacerbate poverty, not only between nations, but certainly within them. And I don't think we have enough evidence of this, of what exactly this is going to look like. But we have seen how AI systems globally have disfavored people of color, women, and the poor. And we need to take these into account much more seriously as we're developing policy responses to AI and data systems here. So Nick Coldry and Ulysses Mejas have published a book in 2019 called The Costs of Connection: How Data is Colonizing Human Life and Appropriating It for Capitalism. And their kind of argument is that there is a new colonial power on the rise in these global data systems. And these systems appropriate human life itself in order to feed the ever-growing data machine. So machine learning required to develop and refine algorithms depends on ever larger real-time data in order to self-learn and self-improve. And with this, life itself, human life itself, is becoming datafied, which is an argument that Shoshana Zuboff also put forward in her book on surveillance capitalism. In South Africa, we are seeing this kind of attitude towards data. Data is oil. This is the draft data and cloud policy that I'm certainly very, very critical of. I don't think data is owned, data is stewarded. That's what good data protection law makes very clear. But this new data policy, which is draft, submissions are due tomorrow, end of day, so please do put in your submissions. This policy suggests that government will co-own, and it isn't completely clear, but it suggests that government will co-own data produced in South Africa and requires that data transferred or stored outside of South Africa, a copy must be retained in South Africa. But it's problematic insofar as it also adheres to this kind of attitude and discourse that data is this new oil. Data is to be collected and appropriated and stored and distributed and shared at any cost, without adequate understanding of who bears the brunt of this, who is being exploited in these kinds of practices. How might it worsen inequality? And where is this data coming from? So the other thing that I think we need to bear in mind in South Africa is that there isn't a strong awareness of what data rights are and how personal data is used. So there was research done by the Human Sciences Research Council in 2019, a study by Benjamin Roberts and colleagues that showed that the South African population has a really limited understanding of how digital technologies work, which many people do. I think they are increasingly more and more complex, how they work and what the effects are on society. But if people don't have a sense of how they work or what their rights are in this regard, they also don't have a sense of how they can use these technologies to better themselves, and to increase kind of entrepreneurship or increase benefits for their communities. So again, it's going to benefit those who have access and understanding to these technologies and worsen inequality. And we know what the kind of digital divide in South Africa looks like. I think it's just less than 60% of the population have access to the internet. It's lower for men than for women. It's much lower for people in rural communities as opposed to people in cities. So how far can data protection law address some of these really kind of large macro structural issues? Given that digital technologies are dependent on real-time data and lots of it, data protection law is considered to be the kind of key legal instrument to protect against the harms to individuals. And I'm talking in the sense that Alex spoke about the European model as data protection law being based on individual rights. And the European Union's GDPR is considered the kind of gold standard in this regard. So I think one of the first things to think about when assessing the role of data protection law in addressing some of these challenges is whether these challenges even are considered to be legal challenges. Globally, there's been a turn instead to ethics, to AI ethics, to data ethics, as a means of mitigating the potential harms to individuals and communities posed by advanced digital technologies. But these standards are not legally binding, and they're often developed by the very companies that are designing and deploying the technologies in question. On the other side of it, data protection law does not address all of the kind of ethical issues that the data society and data-driven technologies are causing. So one of the ways in which this has been made really quite clear is in relation to the exclusion. Popia excludes within its scope data that has been de-identified. As soon as it's de-identified, it's no longer personal information, so it no longer falls under the scope of POPI. But this data was made possible by the individuals that produced it. It very often derives from personal data. And with more and more complex data processing and algorithmic systems, de-identified data can be potentially re-identified. And then these kind of issues, the scope of POPIA then doesn't address the major questions being raised by people like Coldry and Meijas around the datafication of human life. As soon as personal data is taken and then de-identified, we no longer have any rights over that data. So FOLA is participating in a process that I am working on with ASAF, with the Academy of Science of South Africa, to develop a code of conduct for research underneath POPIA. And we are looking at how we can strengthen the provisions of POPIA to address some of the ethical standards posed by the Digital Data Society, as well as just the legal ones. And one of this relates to de-identification, and we're looking into having a kind of right to be de-identified, or to opt in to consent to your data being de-identified, and to be at that point educating data subjects as to what it means for their data to be de-identified. It will still be used, and potentially you will not have any harms directly as a result of this, because it may not be easily re-identifiable, but it still might be used in a way that might ultimately be harmful in the greater scheme of things, in the greater kind of society that processes such huge amounts of data without trying to ensure that it's of benefit to the communities that gave of it. And then another kind of ethical issue that comes outside of the ambit of data protection law is in relation to information that is already on the public record. So information, personal information that is, for example, on social media, companies, bodies, public or private, can use this information without having to obtain the consent of the data subject and without having to notify the data subject. So effectively, as soon as you put your personal information on social media, you lose all rights to it. And this can be potentially really quite problematic in a society where people don't have a good grasp of how their data is used once they put it on such platforms. And don't know the kind of rights they might have. They may have a much higher expectation of privacy than the kind of privacy settings seem to suggest. In terms of the last issue, which I wanted to speak about, this has been spoken about by FOLA and by Alex, which is the potential, actually the very real, I don't think it's even potential, the very real hindrances to participating in the global kind of data market that data protection laws create, and particularly data protection laws like the GDPR and the adequacy requirements that it puts in place. I think the other thing to mention there is that the GDPR has this extraterritorial application, which POPIA, for example, doesn't. So it governs the processing of European data anywhere in the world. And a number of critics have suggested that this amounts to a new kind of regulatory imperialism for the EU, which again will result in major inequalities in the enjoyment and protection of human rights in the digital age, where Europeans have their rights protected and those without access to data protection laws or such strong data protection laws simply don't. So I think just in closing, as we face some of these questions around how the law cannot keep up with technological change, we need to ask the tech instead to slow down and wait for the kind of deliberative and consultative process of lawmaking to take place, including things like conducting social impact assessments, privacy impact assessments, equality impact assessments on new and proposed technologies, which is something we're also proposing under the Code of Conduct for Research that we're developing with ASAF. The information regulator, as the regulatory body for PROPIA, needs to play a role in educating South Africans about digital rights. And the government needs to be addressing much more questions around access and infrastructure in terms of equality and the potential problems that we have there, instead of developing kind of data cloud policies that speak of infrastructure only in terms of how it can enable markets and growth and economic growth without thinking about the kind of questions of social inequality. And then I think we need to think about the role of courts and judges in being able to handle what really are quite complex matters, and how we can hold businesses and government departments to account for the unethical use of data. And we must continue to ask difficult questions and to insist that these developments are not at the costs of the rights of those who live in South Africa, or at the cost of our indigenous knowledge systems, other ways of knowing and understanding the world, or at the cost of those whose livelihoods are already rendered precarious or vulnerable, or at the cost of the sovereignty of the South African state to protect those who live within its borders. So Fola, I'm going to end there. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I know that we are slightly running out of time, but and I know Rachel has to go, but if we could hang on for a few minutes, I'm happy to take questions to any of the participants that have spoken today, and feel free to unmute yourself to ask your question. Professor Kachale.
Thank you. If you want to be formal, Fola, Dr. Adeleke. No, thank you so much, Fola, for this wonderful piece of work and initiative. Fantastic. And to say that I enjoyed all three presentations. Fola and Alex already know, Rachel, if I can call you Rachel, that this is exactly what the Mandela Institute wants to focus on. We agree with you that this sort of sunny view that technological change will overall be beneficial is I think it's a very dangerous discourse, because it actually prevents us from asking all the hard questions. And I'm really excited with the work that you're doing on inequality, for instance. So I have just two questions. One is to Alex. So Alex, if data is non-rivalrous, and so it's inappropriate to think about data as, in traditional legal terms, as a property right, then what explains the huge economic value or wealth that these big tech companies have been able to accrue to themselves? Because there's no doubt that from an economic point of view, the new sources of inequality and wealth creation, put wealth creation in quotes, has got to do with the way they've been able to appropriate the surplus generated through the new forms of monopoly power and so forth associated with these big tech companies, which include, of course, the appropriation of data in our jurisdiction. How do we? Rachel is worried about inequality. We have to be, but we also want to, in the next phase of perhaps human development, want to ensure that Africans people in our part of the world also derive the economic benefit? So that's my first question. Are these companies, it's not property rights that explains then their economic economic model. And to Rachel, so this is a lawyer's question. I understand your argument about the limits of law, but are our new ethical standards, which would be legally unenforceable, the solution? Why is it that these ethical standards that you're proposing should not be also couldn't be considered to be legal standards?
Thank you. We could take a couple of more questions, and then we answer all of it together. Anyone else? All right. Alex, you
Thanks for that. Yeah, Firoz, it's a good question, and I know it's a discussion we've had a couple of times ourselves about, do we want to have our own South African or our own African tech giants as well, and is that kind of part of the reality of the world we live in? On the property question, I think it really does come from a number of things. It comes from the technology itself, as opposed to property rights, right? And the ability to control data. So and sort of the power that comes along with that. So what you're deriving economic value from is being able to give people insights, basically, into how their consumers behave, or something to that effect, right? So it's an analysis or something to that effect that is usually useful. It's also, of course, in order to do that analysis, the control. So I would say, it's what you ultimately offer people as a product, but then also your ability to control information, the extent to which you are technologically superior to others, basically. Because like you can't, I don't think thinking of it as property is really particularly helpful, as much as I would like to do that. I think it comes from those things. Don't know if that quite answers the question, but I hope it does.
Part of an ongoing conversation, but thanks for the response.
So. Sure.
Thanks, Fola. Just to be clear, I'm not advocating for these ethics standards. In fact, they're being called ethics washing because they kind of wash over some of the major challenges associated with digital technologies. So I'm not advocating for that. I do think that data protection law alone is not enough, and certainly a law like POPIA is not strong enough or encompassing enough to address some of the major challenges that we may face. The GDPR, unfortunately, is a stronger piece of law. It is more encompassing. It does offer more rights to data subjects, more explanation, covers things in more detail around automated decision making. And then at the EU level, they've developed a regulation on AI. I think it's just a draft one, which is really quite substantive, and certain technologies like facial recognition technologies that have been shown to exhibit racial and gendered bias are prohibited and are not to be allowed, and I need to check under what conditions that is. The AI regulation does not, the EU one does not address weapons, which is another huge issue, autonomous weapons. It simply doesn't speak to that at all. So I think we must recognize the politics of lawmaking and the politics of law. And the global economy is a big factor that shapes those politics. For example, the EU boasts of having the kind of competitive edge, the cutting edge on AI ethics and AI law. That's where it sees itself as being superior to China and to the US. So there's all this kind of global competition going on, and law is used as within that kind of political space as much as anything else. So I think we need to extend the critical attitude everywhere. I think we need to build and develop our legal frameworks as far as we can. I don't think we're thinking enough about how a constitutional approach can help us in mitigating the negative effects of the 4IR and the digital revolution. I do think, and I completely agree with what Follow was saying earlier about questions of international cooperation. I think that's critical. It's something I haven't explored enough, but certainly ethical standards, and particularly the very Western ethics that it promotes, is not a silver bullet and needs to be considered critically. So I hope that addresses your question.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. And I know we've taken a lot more time than we anticipated. And thank you for staying through the course of today's webinar. I do encourage you to, if you haven't already, sign up for next week's webinar, which is being led by Dr. Shannon Vandenberg. It has an interesting list of speakers. It should include the information regulator, as well as representation from business, Facebook specifically. So we look forward to having this series of conversations through the course of the year as we roll out our different research outputs under this project. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely day.
Fola, can I just ask if you guys could all circulate your presentations?
Yes, we will.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Follow. Thanks, Alex. Bye.
It's good to see you.
Bye, everyone.